And let's see, got it. Okay. So we should be recording. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn the time over to Robert.
All right. Let me know if you can see that okay.
We can.
All right. So like we said, we're going to talk about advanced Fiddler techniques. And you heard a little bit about this in the bio section. I have my Twitter, my email, and my blog information. So I am making the slides available. At the very end, I have a link to where those are. I've used Fiddler for a really, really long time. And I found originally there were only a few people in the room that had used it. These days, I see a lot of people that raise their hand and said they used it, but they use it for basic tracing, requests, things like that. There just seemed to be a gap of what people were using it for and what it was capable of. And that's really where this talk fits in. So we're going to talk about HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So I listed out the three of them that are important at this point. HTTP 1.1 still in use. These are all the RFCs. So you can go read the specs. So I have actually read, I think, all of these, and they're relatively straightforward. It's nice to know what the standards say, even if that isn't necessarily what got implemented. So it's useful to go in and see some of the particulars about what should happen. I'll mention that HTTP 2, there's going to be two versions of Fiddler. I'm going to show most of the stuff tonight in Fiddler Classic. That's the one I've been using for decade or more, and there's a few advanced features that only work in Classic. They do have Fiddler Everywhere, which we'll talk about as well. Fiddler Classic does not support HTTP 2, and neither of them support HTTP 3. So if you were to open up Fiddler and try to get traces with those specific protocols, just be aware it's going to downgrade to one of the other protocols. HTTP is a request and a response paradigm, and each of the request and the response both have a header and a body, and that's what we're going to focus on in the talk. So what is Fiddler? So it's a tracing tool that was built specifically for HTTP and HTTPS. Eric Lawrence wrote it while he was at Microsoft. I think he was working on the clip art team. People would order clip art, they couldn't download it, people would call in for support, and Eric realized there just wasn't a good tool for people to be able to diagnose what was going wrong with HTTP. Back then, I was using tools like Network Monitor, which is similar to Wireshark today. And they work, but they're at more of a packet level. So you have to put them together to see the whole request and the response. I had the honor of meeting him in Austin. I was there for that conference, was the first one in Austin this last year, and that's where he was. So we got to meet him, so that was cool. It was acquired by Telerik in 2012, which has now been purchased by Progress. And like I said, there are two different versions. The Fiddler Everywhere, I'm going to show at the end, is cross-platform. I'll talk about some of the advantages of that. And like I said, we'll be using primarily Fiddler Classic in here. Most of the things will carry forward. I'm just a lot more familiar with it, and I don't want to bounce back and forth when I need to show some of the advanced things. So how does Fiddler work? So it's important to understand that it's a proxy. So it's sitting between the browser and the server. And if you know how a proxy works, the browser is going to send the full request to Fiddler. It has a connection between the browser and Fiddler. Fiddler then basically takes the request, opens up its own connection out to the actual site, and sends the requests and responses. So it's sitting in between, intercepting all of this traffic. So I want to show what it will do by default. So I'm just going to open up Edge here. Oops. Okay. So let's first go out. We'll just go out to the Fiddler page. So by default, if I were to look in here and I go look at my settings, I'm going to look at the proxy settings in System. By default, when I open this up, you'll see there's no proxy server set up at this point. I'll close that out. Now I'm going to actually go open up Fiddler Classic at this point. And then I'll go open the browser again. And for modern browsers, so all the modern browsers automatically pick up on system changes to proxies. So if I go into here now and look at the proxy, you can see it's got a proxy set up. And if you've seen the t-shirt, there's no place like 127.0.0.1. That's the IP address for your own machine. So what Fiddler has done is when it started, it it told Windows, I want to have traffic for HTTP that wants to use a proxy should come to my own machine on port 8888. That's what Fiddler Classic uses. If I move a little to the right, it also does that for HTTPS. So as I said, modern browsers pick up on these settings and automatically will start to watch that traffic go back and forth. If you're doing something where you're trying to test and you're not seeing traffic inside of Fiddler, you just have to make sure that whatever tool you're using understands how to use a proxy and that it's configured correctly. So like I said, the good news, browsers will just do this, but there are some specific programs, and we'll talk about later how you can set those things like in .NET. So that's how Fiddler works. Eric chose the term web sessions when he first made Fiddler. And a web session is, in his mind, a single request and a response. So I'm an ASP.NET developer. When I think about sessions, I'm thinking about multiple requests going on. So I just want you to know in the documentation and such, a single request and response will be what they're talking about with a web session. So I'm going to show you various things that you can do. You can mark particular items. You can add comments. So we'll just pop over and open up this again. I'll open up Classic. And I'm just going to make a request here. I've got a local website. I'm just going to hit Control F5. I'll end up doing that a lot because I want to make sure that it's not just caching stuff in the browser. I want to see the actual traffic. So I just hit Control F5. So what I can see here is the number of requests that went back and forth. So this is the second when I did the refresh. And again, you'll see the request and the response over on the right-hand side. I can look at the inspectors and look at the raw view. And this is what was sent by the browser when it went to that particular host and port. And then if I take off, we'll take off the compression. And if I look at the response, you can see that this is the HTML for the page. Then it's going to ask for all the other stuff. When it parses the HTML, it'll start asking for the CSS, JavaScript, etc. So some of the things I can do, I can right-click here and I can mark things. So it's years ago, I would troubleshoot. I work with other developers, security people, operations people, even vendors. I would have a Fiddler trace and I want to send to somebody and say, you know, here's the problem. I could just go and mark that in orange or red or whatever color I wanted. And I could just add a comment on here saying, you know, this is what is wrong. When you save this archive, then I can send it to somebody and it's easy for me to point out things that they can look for in this particular trace. There's a lot of other things you can do by right-clicking. I'll focus on, you can save off this response. So if I came and said, save the response and the response body. So in this case, if I wanted to save that Bootstrap CSS file, I don't want all of the HTTP request and response headers. I just want the actual file. So it's nice if you're looking for a file, maybe a corporate logo, you're not sure where it is, you can browse to a site that has it and then just come in here and save off that particular file. A couple other things we'll look at here. Searching. So if I come here and look, I can see this halflings. So if I see this request, I might think, I see that web font. I wasn't aware that I was using that. You know, if you have a big enough website, you have multiple developers, you have different vendors and people contributing, you might suddenly see this in a trace and not know where it came from. So what you can do is say, I'm going to come up here and just do a search. I want to find the session that has halflings. And if I hit enter, you can see that it found the actual file because that matched on the URL. What I was hoping it was going to do is it was going to tell me which file included that. I want to be able to trace back and see where that came from. One of the things, if you do a lot of performance work, which I do, you should be using HTTP compression. By default, Fiddler is not decompressing the content before it does a search. So I'm just going to make sure to pick decode compressed content. And if I do a find again now, you can see it's coming from bootstrap.min.css. So that's helpful for me to trace back and say, now I know this particular request was made because it was included with Bootstrap. I can also do that now by right-clicking and say, I just want to find the parent request. So that's another way to more directly. But I just wanted to show you, if you're doing searches, make sure that you have the decode compressed content or it won't search within the individual files if they're compressed. Another cool thing you can do, you can use the Alt key. So if I look here at this request, If I wanted to find all of the CSS files, I can hold the Alt key, and I'm just going to click on any particular column's value. So I'm going to click on this text CSS. It will find all of the other sessions in this list that are also CSS. So it's just a quick way for me to say, okay, there's the CSS. I'll hold the Alt, click on JPEG. It'll do the same thing. So it's just a quick way to see what were the other requests in here that match the value of that particular column. Next thing we'll talk about is decrypting HTTPS. So if you do a lot of security work, I would say that this should concern you, right? The whole point of HTTPS is I don't want somebody to be able to intercept traffic between the browser and the server and be able to see what it looks like. So it seems odd that Fiddler can do this. Fiddler is going to act like a person in the middle, and the advantage of Fiddler being a proxy, it's literally sitting and taking the full request from the client and then re-requesting it from the server. It's off by default, so I'm going to show you how to turn this on. So let's go look at a HTTPS request here. So I'm just going to clear everything that's in here. All right, so I've got a page that uses HTTPS. Let me go there. I'll hit Control F5 again. So if I look by default, all I can see in Fiddler is that it's making a tunnel. So I can see it's made a request to port 443, so that's HTTPS. So I can see that Fiddler saw that there was a connection, but it can't see what was being sent back and forth, right? That's exactly why we want to have HTTPS. I don't want people in the middle to see things. What you can do in Fiddler, I can go into Options, HTTPS, and if you notice, there's a decrypt HTTPS traffic. So I'm going to click that. There's going to be a lot of dialogues that come up here. So I'm just going to explain what these are. Because Fiddler is a proxy, it wants to act like it is the actual web server. So what Fiddler is asking me now, if you know how HTTPS works with certificates, it wants you to trust it as being a local certificate authority. So I'm going to give Fiddler permission to be a trusted root certificate. So I'm going to say yes. It'll ask me a couple more times. Are you really sure? And it explains this. Do you want to do this? Yes, I'll confirm I really do want to do this. And now it's put it in there. So now what's happened, if you're familiar with that, is browsers have a built-in list of certificate authorities they trust. So any certificates that come from things like Let's Encrypt, etc., your browser will trust those if they're signed correctly from one of those authorities. What I've just done is I've said, Fiddler's sitting in between. Anytime it sees an HTTP request, it's going to act like it is that server. So if you can see, I've got Boedi-PA, AzureWebsites.net. Fiddler is going to create what looks like a server certificate for that website. So when I hit OK here, I'll go back and make that request again. Sometimes I have to restart Fiddler, so we'll see what this does. It looks like I'm going to have to here. So I'm just going to start that up again. And when I go back to the page, I hit Control F5. Now, when you go back in, you can see the things you would expect. So here's the HTTP request. I can see Bootstrap again. I'll take the compression off. And here's the actual Bootstrap file. A couple notes on this. This kind of freaks out security people within companies because they say you shouldn't be able to do this. You shouldn't be able to see traffic. All you've done is set on your own machine. When Fiddler is running, I'm going to trust it to impersonate servers that I'm connecting to. So you haven't opened up anything that's going to be elsewhere on your network that people can see things. You are specifically giving Fiddler that permission to intercept. And if you want, you can actually go into the options. We'll go over to the HTTPS. If we open the certificate manager, I go into personal certificates. You can see right here, AzureWebsites.net. It was issued by Do Not Trust Fiddler root. So Fiddler's just saying, I created this. It's not the real server.
Once is that certificate root generated unique to that machine?
Yes.
Did someone take it and use it?
It is, yeah, it's unique to this machine. So I could share it with someone else and say, trust this on your machine. But the Fiddler on this specific machine is going to create a specific certificate that's only usable here. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yep. So what will happen is now I'll send it to Fiddler. It will do the decryption. Fiddler will go out to the actual website, get its real certificate, re-encrypt it. So it's encrypted all the way through the internet to the actual web server, but it's what allows you to see things and intercept here on the clients. Next thing we'll look at is filters. So filters have a lot of different capabilities. The first one is I can show and hide various sessions. I can do some blocking if I want to. You can save your filters. So let's just go look at what these look like. I'm going to close this certificate manager here. I will clear this again. I'm just going to do it the fast way. We'll see this a little bit later. Okay, so I'm going to go to the filters tab. And I can filter a lot of specific things. So again, since the traffic is coming through Fiddler, I can choose whether I want to see things or not. So I could say, for instance, I only want to see traffic from a specific host. If you turn on Fiddler, you'll often see a lot of requests. I mean, a lot of various software programs on your machine are communicating with other HTTP servers in the background. So I may want to come in here and exclude to just see particular hosts. Or if I want to, I can actually go through and say, I only want to see traffic from this specific process. So if you have a process you're looking at and you only want it to come through like the Microsoft Edge for a particular instance, you can do that. Then you won't see all of the other traffic coming through, which is helpful. Next thing you'll see is Fiddler's power is the ability to make modifications. So it's interesting that it can see traffic between the clients and the servers. We're going to start getting into where you can actually change what happens. So I'm going to go back to our site here. I'll hit Control F5. I'm going to go back to this one. So I see my stuff coming here. And again, I can see that Bootstrap in this case, this Bootstrap min is about 13K. And if I click on it, I can see that that's actually compressed, if you're familiar with compression again. The way that actually works is the browsers will send a response or a request header that says accept encoding. So if I were to look at this, the browser said, I accept encoding, gzip, deflate, Brotli. That's just the client telling the server, hey, if you know how to do compression, go ahead and use it. Here I'm going to say, I want to see what happens if that does not get sent from the browser. So if I did this, I'm actually going to have Fiddler now intercept the request and strip that request header. So when I do that, if I make that request again, and we come back, you should see that these files are going to be larger than they were before. So you can see here that JavaScript is now 37K instead of 12. And the same thing with some of these other text files, like the Bootstrap min is 122K now, instead of being about 28K. So this is where we first get interesting, that we can actually make modifications on the fly. And the filters tab is just a quick, easy way to do some of those things. Look at breakpoints a little later. I can hide things. So if you're looking at traces a lot and you see 401, 401, those are authentication demands. If I don't want to see things like that, I can just say I don't want those to show up. I can also split by content types. I can say, hey, maybe I only care about images. Don't show me all the other stuff. Another one that's interesting, you can actually block files. So I just want to block CSS files and do a Control F5, and it looks like you'd expect. It looks horrible, right? There's no styling. Why would I ever want to do that? Well, people do, when they're very serious about performance, do what's called critical CSS, where they actually inline the core CSS needed to get the basic page layout into the actual HTML. And then they download the rest in the background for performance reasons. So it'd be nice to be able to go into Fiddler. It's not easy to make browsers have an issue. So it's easy to come in here and say, just block all the CSS files. That way I can make sure that I've inlined everything I should. Next, if you're doing things like GDPR and you have to see which responses set cookies, you could set that on. I don't have any in this particular site, but if they did the trace, it would show that request in italics, and it would just mark it that that particular request is setting a cookie. So you could look through and see which hosts are actually setting cookies for your site. So that's filters. I'll mention that there is a troubleshoot. So Eric used to get a lot of communications from people saying, hey, I did this, I could see my traffic, I don't see it anymore. And he actually had to come in here and say most of the time people would turn their filters on and forget about them. So if you actually go in the help menu, you can say troubleshoot filters. it will show you things that are filtered out as a strike through. So he said it was so common that people forgot they set up a filter on that. He needed a way for people to be able to see that I'm blocking it myself via a filter, if that makes sense.
So are filters, once you set filters, did they persist from system restarts or
so you can save them.
Restarts or?
Yeah, so you can save them, and they're, so as far as Fiddler Classic is concerned, I don't believe it's going to keep them. I'm going to do this just to see. By default, I think they go away each time I'm doing that with Fiddler. And when I go back in, there's a way to save and load those. Oh, it did save it. Okay. So if you want to, you can also do export these. Like you can save and load them. So if you have, here's a set of filters I want to use when I'm doing this testing versus this testing, you could save off those separate filter sets. But it looks like otherwise it just kept what I had picked from my last one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I'm certainly one of the people who would turn something on in one session and then go a couple of days without firing up Fiddler and come back and not be able to remember why I'm not able to see things. So,
and that's exactly that's exactly why he did the troubleshoot. But yeah, having different scenarios where you want different filters, it's helpful to be able to save as well and load. So
excellent, thank you.
Yep. So this is where we start getting really interesting. So Fiddler actually got its name because you can fiddle with requests. In other words, I want to be able to see a request or response and actually do more changes than just what I saw in that filter tab. So you can create them manually if you want to, but it's easier to drag and drop. So I'm just going to show you an example of what I mean. So let me go back in here first. I'm going to take off my, okay, so my blocking's gone. I'll hit Control F5 here. So what I can do is I can say, let's see what happens if I were to play with one of these files. So here's the request for the Bootstrap min. I'm just going to drag that over and drop it in the Composer tab. So what it does is it replicates everything about that request up top here, and then I can modify whatever I want. So you do this a lot for security testing or when you need to tweak something. Like I said, it's not easy to make a browser not support compression. But it's easy to do here. So again, there's the request header. I can simply delete it and say I want to execute that request again. And now if you look, instead of being the 28K, it's 122K. So it noticed it took my modified request and sent that to the server. And then that came back now without compression. So it's a great way to be able to make literally any changes. Like I said, I could come here and just start typing if I want to. I can type in anything I want. It's just easier to start with something. So I drag it over and modify it. Next thing you can do, you can execute curl commands. So if you're familiar with curl, I end up working with a lot of security people. They tend to like to use curl. They'd say, here, do this curl request. And I would look in Windows. Windows by default does not have a curl client. So then I started looking for what's a safe curl client. And I was not having a whole lot of luck. So it was nice. I found in the scratch pad here, you can actually execute curl commands. So the curl here is just saying go into Bing. So if I do that and we look at the inspector, you can see it actually came from curl in Fiddler. So if you do a lot of curl stuff, just know that's built in the scratch pad, which is useful. Next one is breakpoints. So I'm going to show you one more that's a little more interesting. Let me do this one first. So let's say I'm checking my website. I've got this tablet here I want to get for $1,095. I'm going to just do a checkout here. And it says, hey, you ordered one, $1,095. That's your total price. When you're testing the site, you want to make sure that the server is doing enforcement of rules. So I can come in here and look at that post request. I'm going to drag that over to Composer here. Oops. Do that one more time. So here's the post where I actually hit the button and sent the request. But if you look, there's something odd here. It's actually submitting the price to the server, right? Well, let's say I want to give myself a little discount. I'm going to test and see, did the developer code this correctly? In other words, hopefully they are not using a cost sent by a client that could make any modification it wanted to. So I'm going to execute that. Come back, I'll look at the inspectors. And if I look at the raw content, and I'll just pop it in a notepad to make it a little easier to read. So it says, hey, this order will be billed at the cost of $1 each, right? Again, that's not easy to make the browser specifically hack that number in the post request, but it was easy for me to do that. And I can do that then and ensure that the server side is doing the right kinds of checks rather than relying on what the client would send for a price. Okay, so the next one is breakpoints. So if I go back in here, I'm going to clear this and I'm going to go back to this normal site we're on. Hit Control F5. Okay, I'm going to type BPU. So if there's this quick exec area down here, think of it as a built-in command shell that you can run things. And one of the commands you can run is BPU and then the name of a file. So what I'm saying to Fiddler is I want you to set a breakpoint. Anytime you see a request come in for that file, I want you to pause before you send it to the server. So I'm going to hit enter there. I'm going to go hit Control F5 again. You'll notice that Fiddler is kind of glowing. And if I come in here, you can see here's the request to Bootstrap. There hasn't been a response yet. It's actually sitting and waiting. So if I look on the right-hand side now, I can come in here and make modifications again. So we'll just stick with the example we're doing. I'm going to take off compression and then say run to completion. And when it comes back, you'll see it wasn't compressed again because I modified it. I can do the same thing. So I'm going to type BPU space and just clear that breakpoint. I'm going to do BP after. So not only can I get it on the way to the server, in this case, I said, when you see site CSS coming back as a response, I want you to pause. So I'm going to hit Control F5 again. I'll come in here. You'll see the same thing. It's sitting now waiting. It went to the server. It got site.css. And now it's sitting here waiting for me to make changes. So I'm just going to come in here and change the color to green and then say run to completion. And then if I go back into the browser, you'll see it's been impacted. So I use this feature a lot. There's times where I don't feel like somebody might say, we got to make a change to the style sheet. I don't feel like going through and trying to deploy it, especially on a production site. With Fiddler sitting in between, I can literally make changes on the fly and see what kind of impact that'll have either going to the server or coming back to the client. So that's a pretty powerful way to do those things. I go turn that off now. I'm just going to type BPA, hit enter. So that is breakpoints. The next one is autoresponder. So again, because Fiddler is a proxy, it can actually return information without actually talking to the web server. So this is easier if I show you what I mean. Let me clear this stuff out. Do Control F5 again. So what I can do is I say, I want to see what would happen if this Bootstrap CSS took a while to return. So I'm going to go over to the autoresponder here. I'm going to drag that request over. And what it says is if you see a request for bootstrap min.css, and you can do regexes, all sorts of things. So this one's just saying if you specifically see a request to that URL, I want you to do something different. So in this case, I just want to say, make that be intentionally slow. So this is milliseconds. So basically wait for 15 seconds. I want to see what would happen to my site if my CSS was slow. And you'll see in a minute here, it's completely blank, right? Which you would probably expect. I use this a lot to test third parties. So if you use sites like most developers do, they have analytics, they have other vendors saying, please include me, it's a pixel, it's a tag, whatever. You need to be really careful how you're using third-party resources. And so I've had vendors say to me, if you just put this, of course, put it in the head because our stuff is super important and make it be the very first one. I tell them if you're not deferring those correctly, you can actually make my whole site break. And they usually don't know this at the time. So I show them by dragging it over, making it slow. Or I can actually come up and say, what would happen if I got a 404? Like if you weren't available for some reason, what would happen? And then I can show them that's what happens. So it's a lot easier to discuss with people by showing them visuals like that and being able to use autoresponder to make specific requests fail and behave differently. So this is one of the major things that Fiddler is really very unique about. You can actually change if I wanted to. I won't go through it all here in this demo, but I could save off all of these files locally to my laptop. I could set up these responder rules, and basically I go in the browser. It would look like I'm going to the server, but it's actually pulling it all off a disk. So if you have a super important demo for investors or whatever, you want to make sure it's not going to break, you could actually store it all locally in your machine. It'll look like in the browser it's actually going to the server and doing everything it should, but you have it canned pulling off your specific laptop. The other place we use this a lot, we do have designers and we do have front-end developers who, like for instance, we have somebody doing our CSS and they say, I think I know what's wrong, but I don't want to give it to you, make you put it through the whole process, get it out to a staging environment or a production environment. You can actually just save off this request. So I could just say save that response body. I could save it on my laptop here. So I tell them, go save off a local copy of the CSS on your machine, set up a rule that will pull that CSS from your machine instead of the server, and make whatever changes you want in that local CSS file. So they can do all their troubleshooting what if scenarios on that CSS without risking any sort of deployment. And from a browser's perspective, it's getting that CSS from the server when it's really pulling it locally off disk. So it's really cut a lot of our back and forth time working with different developers by allowing them to make localized changes like that. And that's what I would do with autoresponder. Next thing is, so I've used Fiddler for a really long time. I'm troubleshooting my e-commerce site. We started making a responsive website quite a few years ago. So it works at various breakpoints. We want it to look good on a phone, tablets, large desktops, etc. So I got used to troubleshooting and doing all these tricks with Fiddler, but then I'd be staring at a phone, right? Somebody would come and say, here's your iPhone, it's not working. You can actually configure it to route the phone's traffic through Fiddler. So I'm going to show you how you would do that here. So the basic idea is I'm still going to run Fiddler on my, I'm running Windows. I'm running it on my Windows laptop. So what I can do, just show you in the, so in an iPhone, you don't actually set proxy settings in the browser. They're actually part of your Wi-Fi setup. So if you go into, I have an iPhone, I go into Wi-Fi. If you go to the bottom, you can manually set a proxy. So in this case, I got the IP address of my laptop and I put the port is 8888. That's where Fiddler's running. So I'm just telling my iPhone, please manually proxy through that laptop on that port. And when I do that, I can make a request on the phone and the site would look like what you'd expect. But if I open up the Fiddler trace, I've been doing everything like I normally would, right? I'm just sitting here in Fiddler. They're actually doing stuff on the device. I could set breakpoints, I could intercept, I could make changes on the fly. And if you look at what you see here, you can see that this is actually coming from an iPhone right there. So it's just handy. I started using this for devices, for phones and stuff, because it's hard to troubleshoot on a phone otherwise. But I also like this because I would have senior VP in marketing that said something's not working on her machine with the website. Generally, I don't want to install stuff on their machine because 6 months from now when their printer doesn't work, it's going to be my fault because I installed something on their machine, right? Instead, what I'll do is I'll say, set your proxy settings to my IP address and my port. Now they can do anything they want remotely on their machine, and I'm able to see in Fiddler all the traces that I need to be able to see, if that makes sense. There's also a way to do a reverse proxy. Sometimes it's hard to set a proxy in certain clients. And so they do have documentation on this, what reverse proxy that you can actually set up. It's just a little more complicated to get through here, but that's your other choice if you can't set the proxy. Some common issues. So things I've seen, every time I get a good trace, I usually come down here and turn off capturing. Like I said, you've got so much on your machine going on. As soon as I get just the requests I want, I turn that off. I will still go later then, open my browser, go to a page, and I'll come back and say, why did I not see that in Fiddler? It's because I turned this off, right? The other thing you can do, you saw how you could pin it down to one process. I usually set this to web browsers. it eliminates some of the other services running on Windows that are also using HTTP, just so I don't have to see all the requests up here. So just be aware if you're not seeing tracing in Fiddler, it could be because you turned it off or you set it to a setting that your service is no longer being traced. The other thing to be aware of, I'll show you this one too. You can actually set, I gotta get my, sorry, toolbar's blocking it. You can actually drag this any process and drop it on a specific browser instance. And if you see, if you go back up in the header, you can see it says Explorer 7812. That's the process of just that Edge browser. So again, I can limit it to be just that browser's traffic. Problem is people would do that and then say, I can't trace anymore. And they forget you have to come up here and click that again, just to say, I'll take any process now, especially when they close their browser. They'll close their browser. That process with that PID is now dead. They don't see any traffic anymore. We were talking about browsers automatically pick up proxy changes in Windows. It turns out in .NET, so I have an ASP.NET site. It makes requests out to web services, REST services, other web APIs. I can trace from the client to my ASP.NET server. I just run IIS with ASP.NET on my development machine. But I also want to see the traffic going out to those third parties. Those aren't by default traced. So .NET classes do not respect Windows proxy settings. So by default, if you go, this is one way to do it. You can go into your .NET configuration and set up a default proxy. This will tell all of the .NET classes like HTTP client, all the things that are calling those services that, hey, we're available over here at this address. That will route them through Fiddler. So just be aware if you're running stuff, you're not seeing it in Fiddler, it could be any of these problems, right? The client's just not being proxied correctly for some reason. Okay. Next thing that is cool is Fiddler script. So we showed how you could manually modify traffic. I might want to be able to programmatically change things in Fiddler. So it has a built-in Fiddler script. So if I come in here, I can say customize rules. It's going to open up a script editor. I'm just going to search for my comment here. So there's various events that occur. So like this one, on before request will fire when a request comes from the client before it gets sent to the server. And one of the things I could do here is I could just play with this and say, hey, if it's a request for a JPEG file, show it in yellow. So I'm going to go back, make my request again. Control F5, go back into Fiddler. And now you'll see, so I'm changing how the session looks in this case. You can do a lot of things with script. One of them that I find interesting personally is when we're talking about third parties. I will actually come in and write code like this, where I say, if you're my host, you're okay. If you're my CDN, you're okay. If you're anybody else, make them sleep for 25 seconds. This is the way I can see if I have any single point of failures that are dependent on any other internet host besides my own. So I can do this. I do this pretty often just to make sure that none of my third parties are programmed in a way that they can impact my actual site. I would just uncomment that stuff, go over, run my page, and if suddenly things are not working or menus don't function or JavaScript is being blocked, I can then start to figure out which particular host is causing me that problem. But it's a great way to know that you're set up correctly to not be slowed down by those things. There's an on before response. So that would be when it's coming back from the server. There's also an on exec action. So that comes into play. This command line at the very bottom here is called the quick exec area. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to have the ability to clear stuff out of my list by host. That wasn't something that Fiddler actually had available. So I actually wrote that in Fiddler script. So if I came over here, I can just say Control F, remote host, or remove host, excuse me. So I wrote a little code in this on exec action that says if you say remove host, it'll pull the host name off and it'll hide it. So I'm basically extending how Fiddler's working. Now I can say remove host 192.168.1.88, hit enter. And if that worked like I wanted it to, and it looks like it didn't, I'm gonna do one by the host instead. I'll just do localhost here. You can see all of my localhost sessions disappeared. So I was basically extending how quick exec works through scripting. So the cool thing is there's they call it jscript.net. It's kind of a JavaScript looking, but it has access to some .NET objects that you can use to make modifications. So it's just a cool way to do some of that stuff via script. Next one is there are Fiddler extensions. So you can actually write your own extensions. There's a couple cool ones here. I just want to show you. You can go out to that add-ons list. So the first one I'm going to show you, I'm going to clear this stuff. So CLS is one of the, it just clears all those. I am going to say I want to make JavaScript pretty. And what this does is I'm using minified files. And by default, I want to be able to go in here and see what those look like. So you can see these were minified files, but now sitting in between, Fiddler has intercepted them and unminified them. So it's not back to the original. You'd use source maps for that, but it took and did some clever spacing in return, so it's more readable. Another one I like is called show image bloat. If you see Eric and follow him on Twitter, you'll notice this. He'll post every so often just an image with a bunch of bricks in it and not say anything else. And that's show image bloat. And what that is images have a way to store metadata. So when you take your pictures on your phone, depending on how your phone is set up, you might get lat long, you might get a whole bunch of other stuff. So let me go pull that up here. So I'm just going to look at this London one. And if I go look at properties and go to details, you can see here's all the stuff. I took it with a Canon PowerShot G9. Here's my shutter speed. Nobody cares about, none of my customers care about that, right? But that's weighing down my image size. So if I come back here and look on that particular image, 43% of that image's size is actually the metadata. So there's tools. I use JPEG Tran. We'll strip that stuff out of the images. So basically I can make my image 43% smaller without sacrificing any image quality by removing that metadata. So that extension is cool just because I can do a quick check. I can run through the page and say, hey, all of those images are okay. All the ones that are up here aren't. So again, if you watch, Eric will just do that occasionally where he posts and shows those bricks. And that's just because they did not remove their metadata. A quick mention, Fiddler caps. I was talking about other people that are not techie people needing to be able to do troubleshooting with me. So there's a tool called Fiddler Cap. They can install this. Again, sometimes today I don't generally like to install stuff, but if I need to, it makes it very simple for a non-techie person. I can tell them, please make sure you clear your cookies, clear your cache, make sure you have decryption turned on. They just then hit start capture. It opens a browser. They do everything that they want to, and then they can stop it, save the capture, and mail it to me. So it's a small client that simplifies what a non-technical person would have to do. When they send it to me, however, I open that up and it's just like they captured it with Fiddler. All the same details are there. Another cool thing, I'm sure this never happens to you, but somebody says, hey, the website didn't work. And you say, well, what didn't work? It just didn't look right. That's not terribly helpful. If they hit this snapshot key, it'll actually take a picture of the screen at the time and embed that into the capture so that later on I can see not just it didn't look right, I can see exactly what was wrong on that particular page. So again, this is just a separate install if you have non-technical people you need to capture stuff with. Bunch of miscellaneous stuff. We talked about how you could save response files. There's also a screenshot in Fiddler. So I'm going to go open up Classic again. If I were to do a capture up here on it's underneath my toolbar here again, there's a camera. I could click that. It'll give me a 5-second timeout. So I click the camera. I would flip over quick to the page. It'll take a screenshot and embed it into the actual trace. That way, when they save and send me that, I'll be able to see the actual screenshots. You can actually encrypt your traces. So by default, when you come in here and say, I want to save all my sessions, you can say, I want it to be password protected. So it's using actually strong AES encryption, 128-bit by default. You can change it to 256. So if you're sending traces, especially outside of your network, to a vendor or a security person, make sure you do the password protected, because then these traces do have sensitive things, right? I mean, especially if you're decrypting HTTPS, there could be a lot in there you don't want people to see. So you can save that encrypted and then tell them the password. Obviously, don't put it in the same email that you're sending the trace in. Somehow communicate through another band to say, here's the password for that trace. And it uses, like I said, solid AES encryption to make sure what was captured in that trace is not read by somebody else. There is a text wizard. So if you do a lot of conversions, like if you need to take base 64, a lot of times you'll do, I've been doing capture the flag lately, and I'll see something that's in a base 64, I can just come in and decode it. So you can just play with simple conversions. You can do some hashing, other decoding, HTML encoding. It's just built here into the text wizard property. You can write your own inspectors. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but basically if you had a custom protocol that sent stuff back and forth, you could actually create your own inspector to view it. So I know somebody did WCF binary traffic, was not really useful to look at in Fiddler, so they made their own extension that allowed them to understand what that looked like better. You can also impersonate different user agents. So if there's times I can come here and say tools or rules, I'm sorry, user agents. You can see this is a bit dated. Nobody wants to act like they're IE6, right? But I can create a custom one. So if there's a reason that I want to appear to the server as a different user agent string, I can impersonate it by setting it there. Next one, we talked about the quick exec. So I'm going to make another request here just so I can show that. If I go back into Classic, there's things down here like I can say I want to see greater than 50,000 bytes, and that will just highlight the ones that are bigger, or less than 1,000. So there's all sorts of things if you're a command line person that you can do down here. You could say select all of the CSS files. It will highlight all of them. I've been using this CLS, which just clears the screen. So if you like using command line, there's an extensive set of things you can do via the quick exec. You can do host remapping. So I've read, I'll show you the reference at the end. Eric wrote a book on Fiddler. I've read it probably 10 times. Every time I go through it, I see something and I think, I don't know why I'd do that. So this is one of those. If you've been out to example.com, it's a really simple website here. Shut that for a minute. Do that again. Hit Control F5. Okay, so this is example.com. What I want to do is be able to map that request to a different place. So if I go into hosts, I can actually set up a rule that says, if you ask for example.com, I really want you to use the site that's on my own machine here at port 86. So if I do that again now, you'll see it looks to the browser like it's on example.com, but this is pointed at my machine. So I scratch my head, why would I ever need this? I realized one day we have a lot of JavaScript on our site that looks at the URL and will only run in production. Only if it's www will this stuff run. Well, I was trying to troubleshoot and I wanted to use my Visual Studio debugger, but when I did that, I was running local and it didn't look like production. So I could use that host mapping. I would trick out the browser to think it was on www, and yet it was pointed at my local IIS sites. I was doing the debugging, but everything in the browser thought, hey, I'm in production. So all the JavaScript did what I needed it to do. So just a cool thing to use if you had a case like that.
So quick question about that. I think in the screen that you popped up, I saw a link about importing the hosts, importing your Windows host. So this is the host settings is independent of your normal Windows host file.
Yes.
And exists only in Fiddler, huh?
Yes.
Well, that's awesome.
So yeah. If you're used to using host files, that's like system wide and everything does that, but it'll go to the real place. This is only if you're proxying your traffic through Fiddler and it sees example.com, it'll route it there. So like I said, I scratched my head on I would never use this. And then one day it was like, that is exactly what I need to be able to do, is to impersonate another site like that. So
Okay, and again, I guess it looks like that persists
sorry.
from
Yes, because I had left
application
that
start
on.
and restart. So
Yep.
if you've got a whole bunch of Windows hosts rewrites set up, you could just import them to here and then clean out your Windows host file and just use it in Fiddler. That's cool.
Yeah, and you can just turn that on or off, and you can turn it on or off here, so it won't actually do the remapping.
Excellent.
Yeah. Okay, so that's Fiddler Classic. Like I said, it's been around for a long time. I've used it for more than a decade. I use it practically every day. Fiddler Everywhere has now been created, and the goal for that was to be multi-platform. So there were multiple attempts in the past to get Fiddler Classic to run on Linux and such, but they just never really got all the way there. So now Progress has a team specifically working on Fiddler Everywhere to do just that. So it's multi-platform. So it runs Windows, Linux, and Mac. It's a much streamlined UI. So it's not as busy. I know where everything is in Classic just because I've used it forever. People that are new to it don't necessarily think it's as intuitive as something improved like what you'll see in Fiddler Everywhere. It also helps with collaboration. So there's a lot of stuff built in there to let you collaborate with team members or other people to be able to share captures in a secure way rather than email. Like I said, it does have HTTP2 support. So that's the cool stuff. The missing features from an advanced standpoint, it still doesn't do extensions. It doesn't have Fiddler script breakpoints, and it doesn't have quick exec. So if you're looking for cross-platform, you'll see it as a win. If you're not used to Classic and you just want to use this other UI, that could be a win. It is a subscription service. That's the other notice, is there's a fee for this and there's not for Classic. They've been adding features as they go. So at some point, I hope that it catches up with some of those other features that we're talking about in our advanced talk. So I'm just going to open up Fiddler Everywhere. It does most of the things you would expect, just in a slightly different way. So I'm going to show you quick what the UI looks like. Again, I'm going to be signed on here when it comes up. And it's got rules, which are really the autoresponder. So I can come in here and do the same things you'd expect. Control F5. And I'm in here. Sorry, I got some filters set up too, so it's only showing particular stuff. So let me pull back to where I was. Hit Control F5. So you can see I'm able to see things like I could before. I could right click and do a lot of the marking, commenting, saving. I can directly add a rule, which is the new name for the autoresponder. I can also do the composer that you saw before. So I can just say, please let me edit this directly in the composer. And it gives me a nice view here where I can just say, hey, I want to take off accept encoding again and re-execute the request. So the same functionality, just in some different places. The other cool thing here is I'm able to save off requests and responses. So if you do a lot of testing where you've got a certain set of requests you want to be available to you all the time, you can save those off here and then just reissue them rather than have the client to do it again. And then I can also share with other people. So we talked about some of the collaboration features, and that will show up here. Again, all the decryption, all the other things that you would expect here. And like I said, the rules, I have quite a bit of rules in here. But from a time perspective, again, because it's an advanced, I wanted to show you the stuff in Classic. Most of the stuff, I'd say most people would probably be just fine with what Fiddler Everywhere gives now, especially if they want cross-platform. It's just those specific advanced things may not be there yet.
Question for you. If I have a Fiddler cap, can I load it into Fiddler Everywhere?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, so if you do a classic, like Fiddler Classic and save, or if you use the Fiddler cap. So Fiddler cap's the name of that simple tool. So you're talking about like a session archive, right? A capture like an SAZ from Fiddler Classic.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can just pull that into Fiddler Everywhere. So if you like to use Fiddler Classic, you can do that and then hand it off to somebody who's on a Mac and they can pull it up in Fiddler Everywhere and see what they want to see.
Yeah, you do. Thank you.
Okay. Pardon? Okay.
Just a thank you.
Okay. So some resources. I have 2 Pluralsight courses on Fiddler Classic. The most recent one is you have a problem on a website. What's the right tool? Should you be using DevTools? Should you use Fiddler? Does it work in both? Which one makes more sense? And then the one here is a lot more advanced into specific Fiddler, like how do you write an extension? How do you extend? Just things that go even beyond some of the stuff I covered in the talk today, just from a time perspective. This is Eric's book. Like I said, I've read it probably 10 times. Just go back through it again, looking for things I might have missed. And then I also did a video series. So as I said, I'm a progress ninja for Fiddler, which is similar to Microsoft MVP for them. I've created a video series out there on various things that you can do. So we'll take a look at how to do some of the same things we talked about before, just with some of the tracing, debugging, how you can do the phone tracing, how you can check sites performance by using Fiddler everywhere. So if you're using Fiddler everywhere, these are a lot more specifically targeted things for what you can do in that. And with that, that's my Twitter, my email, my blog. That's the link to the slides and the code. And we have some time if you have any other specific questions.